I had always considered my home a refuge. The Victorian mansion on a quiet street in Westminster, with its high ceilings, creaky floorboards, and stained glass windows, had become my refuge after the death of Farley, my husband. 52 years together, and for the third year, I've woken up alone in our bedroom, where every object holds memories. This morning, I woke up to the clinking of dishes on the main floor. The clock on the bedside table read 7:30, too early for my usual cup of tea, which Doris, my housekeeper, usually brings at 8. I threw on a robe and walked down the wide staircase, clinging to the banister a little tighter than I'd like to admit at 73. "Oh, good morning, Marigold." Ennis's voice echoed down the hall before I could enter the dining room. She always calls me by my first name, never Mother, or at least Mrs. Winslet. "We didn't want to wake you." We being Ennis and my son Thatcher, who was sitting at the table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He barely looked up to greet me. "Good morning," I replied, looking around the dining room. Something was different. For a second, I couldn't figure out what it was until my gaze settled on the buffet. The china set that Farley and I had brought back from China 30 years ago was gone. In its place were white minimalist plates I'd never seen before. "Where's the china set?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, that old one?" Ennis waved her hand as if warding off a fly. "I put it away in the pantry. It's so archaic, Marigold. These new plates are much more practical, and you can wash them in the dishwasher." Without my permission, it was not a question, but a statement. "Mother," Thatcher finally intervened, "Ennis is just trying to modernize the house. You know how hard it is to find a maid who's willing to mess around with hand-washing china." I wanted to argue that Doris had never complained about my china in 15 years of service, but I kept silent. This was the first instance of such interference, but by no means the last. She and Thatcher had moved in with me 6 months ago. "Temporarily," Thatcher had said then, "until the renovations to our apartment are finished." The renovations to their apartment, which I had helped them buy, by the way, had somehow stretched from the planned 3 weeks to infinity. At first, I was glad for the company. After Farley's death, the house seemed too empty, too quiet. For the first few weeks, Ennis had been gracious, cooking dinners, bringing me magazines, inquiring about my collections. Thatcher, my only child, whom I'd raised practically alone while Farley pursued a diplomatic career, was around again. I thought it was a chance to rebuild the closeness we'd lost when he left to go to university and then married Ennis. But gradually, things began to change. First, Farley's pictures from the living room disappeared. Ennis said they disrupted the interior concept. Then my art history books were moved from the library to the pantry because they were taking up too much space. My violets on the windowsills were replaced by some fancy succulents because they don't require much care. "By the way, Doris isn't coming in today," Ennis said, pouring herself another cup of coffee. "I gave her the day off." "Without me knowing?" I felt my fingers tighten around the arm of the chair. "She looked tired yesterday," Ennis shrugged, "and I thought she could use a rest. Besides, I'm quite capable of handling the house on my own. I've got lots of ideas for making it more modern." Thatcher nodded approvingly, keeping his eyes on the newspaper. Always the same. Avoiding conflict at all costs, preferring to agree with the loudest voice in the room. That voice used to be mine. Now it was Ennis's. After breakfast, I went up to my office, the only room that had so far escaped Ennis's modernization. Here, among my catalogs of antiques and my collection of miniature 18th century snuff boxes, I still felt like myself, Marigold Winslet, a respected antique appraiser whose opinion had once been valued at auctions throughout Europe. I sank into a chair and looked at Farley's picture on the table. "What would you do, darling?" I thought. But there was no answer. Farley had always been a diplomat, not only by profession but by nature. Perhaps he would find a way to talk to Thatcher without causing a confrontation. There was a knock at the door and I flinched. "Come in." It was Ennis with a tray. "I brought you tea," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I know you're used to Doris bringing it at this time." "Thank you." I accepted the cup, noticing that it wasn't my usual Earl Grey but some sort of herbal concoction. "What is it?" "Chamomile mint tea," Ennis answered. "It's healthier for you than that strong black tea you drink." At your age, you need to watch your heart. At my age. This phrase has become a refrain in our conversations. At your age, you shouldn't lift heavy things. At your age, it's best not to walk up and down stairs alone. At your age, it's important to follow a regimen. My heart has been working fine for the last 73 years, I said dryly. I think it can handle Earl Grey too. Ennis pressed her lips together. I'm just looking out for you, Marigold. Thatcher and I want you to be healthy for as long as possible. So I don't die before the renovations to their apartment are finished, I thought cynically, but kept silent. By the way, Ennis continued, I invited some friends over for dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just a little soiree. At my house? I couldn't contain my surprise. Well, technically, it's our house now, too, Ennis smiled. Besides, it would do you good to socialize. You spend too much time alone. With those words, she walked out, leaving me with the herbal tea I had no intention of drinking. In the past, I would have objected, reminded her that the house belonged to me, that I had the right to decide who visited it and when. But lately, I hadn't had the energy to argue. Every conflict with Ennis turned into a one-actor theater, where I invariably turned out to be a nagging, ungrateful mother-in-law. And she, a patient daughter-in-law forced to put up with my whims. By evening, the house was filled with strangers. Young couples, Thatcher's colleagues in his architectural firm, a few of Ennis's friends, all of them talking too loudly, laughing too heartily at not particularly funny jokes, and drinking my wine without even noticing its quality. I sat in the corner of the living room, watching Ennis flit between the guests like a ball hostess. She wore one of her designer dresses that cost as much as the average retiree's monthly pension. Thatcher followed her, smiling and nodding as she introduced him as a talented architect who will soon open his own studio. I knew that wasn't true. Thatcher was just one of the junior partners at the firm, and he could only dream of his own studio. But Ennis always exaggerated his accomplishments, as if trying to convince others and herself that she had married someone more important than he was. When dinner was served, I found myself at the far end of the table, almost at the door to the kitchen, while Ennis sat at the head, the place that had always belonged to me or Farley. Marigold, do you mind if we put on some music? One of Ennis's friends asked, not waiting for an answer and already heading for my antique music system. Actually, I prefer... I started, but I was interrupted by Ennis. Sure, Daphne, play whatever you want. Marigold usually goes to bed early, so I don't think she'll be with us long. A few of the guests exchanged understanding glances, and I felt like a nuisance at their party rather than a hostess. At dinner, the conversation turned to travel. Someone mentioned Venice, and I couldn't resist commenting. Farley and I spent our 30th wedding anniversary in Venice, I said, turning to the young couple across the table. It was in the early 90s. We stayed in a little palazzo on the Grand Canal, and one evening... Oh, Marigold is talking about his travels again, Ennis interrupted me loudly from across the table. You wouldn't believe how many stories she can recall about every town she and Farley have ever been to. Sometimes I think we've already heard about every Venetian gondola. The guests laughed and I fell silent, feeling the color flood my cheeks. Ennis continued, now addressing the man sitting next to her. Have you been to that new restaurant in Soho? They say the truffle pasta there is amazing. The conversation flowed on, flowing around me like water flows around a rock. I sat silently picking at my food, some fancy quinoa dish that Ennis had ordered from the restaurant, though I would have preferred something more traditional. My thoughts drifted back to the times I'd hosted dinner parties myself, when guests would come to hear me talk about rare finds at auctions or Farley's diplomatic stories. As dinner drew to a close, I quietly apologized and got up from the table. I need a cup of water, I said, heading toward the kitchen. Thatcher, get your mom some water, Ennis commanded. She shouldn't walk on her own in case she falls. I froze in place. In case she falls? Like I'm an invalid? Like I can't walk 15 steps to the kitchen in my own house? I'm perfectly capable of walking to the kitchen on my own, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I'm not that decrepit yet. Ennis rolled her eyes, a gesture that didn't escape me. Thatcher smiled awkwardly and went back to talking to his colleague. Neither of them stood up for me. No one even noticed my humiliation. In the kitchen, I poured myself not water, but a glass of red wine and drank it in a gulp, something I hadn't done in years. The wine burned my throat, but it was a pleasant burning, a reminder that I was still alive, still able to feel. When I returned to the dining room, the guests had already moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. I sat silently in my chair in the corner, watching Ennis show off the new vase she'd placed on the mantelpiece right where my and Farley's honeymoon picture used to be. "It's an exclusive design," she said. "Cost a fortune, but it fits in perfectly, doesn't it?" I wanted to say that the vase looked like a cheap Art Nouveau knockoff, that it had no soul or history, unlike every object I'd spent years collecting for this house. But I remained silent. The boundaries of my influence in my own home grew more and more invisible, more and more transparent, until one day I knew they would disappear altogether. The guests left around midnight. I had long since retired to my room, unable to bear any more false smiles and condescending glances. Lying in bed, I could hear Ennis and Thatcher talking in the hallway. "Your mother is getting weirder and weirder," Ennis said. "Did you see the way she was looking at my vase, as if she wanted to break it?" "She's just getting old," Thatcher replied with the same condescending tone he always used to talk about me now. "It's hard for her to accept change. We need to think seriously about the future." Ennis's voice was quieter, but I could still hear every word. "This house is too big for her alone. Maybe it's time to think about other options?" I knew what they meant. A nursing home. Or at best, a small apartment somewhere on the outskirts while they took over my mansion. The house that Farley and I had turned into a work of art, every corner of which held a piece of our lives. I turned on my side and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness of the night, the thought I'd been chasing away all these months finally took shape with clarity. My son and his wife were waiting for me to die, or at least the moment when I would be weak enough for them to take away everything I cared about under the pretense of caring for me. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fight it. A week passed after that humiliating dinner party. I tried to stay away from Ennis and Thatcher, spending most of my time in my office. Doris, returning from a forced day off, became my quiet ally. She brought me proper tea, cooked my favorite dishes, and occasionally lingered to talk. Real conversation, not the condescending phrases my sister-in-law bestowed on me. On Wednesday, Thatcher announced that we would have a family dinner on Sunday. "Just the three of us," he said with that special smile he used to get as a kid when he wanted another cookie before bedtime. "Just like old times." I looked at him skeptically, but agreed. Part of me still hoped we could restore what had been lost between us. Maybe in a more intimate setting, without strangers, Thatcher would once again become my son instead of a will-less appendage to his wife. On Sunday, I wore my favorite blue silk dress that Farley had brought me from Japan. It was old-fashioned, but elegant, and most importantly, it reminded me of the times when I was loved and respected. I even pulled out a pearl necklace that I usually only wore for special occasions. Ennis noticed my outfit when I came down for lunch. "How nice of you to dress like that for our little lunch," she said in a tone that might have been taken as a compliment if it hadn't been for the slight mockery in her eyes. That dress must have been very fashionable, once upon a time. I ignored the jab and sat down at the table, which was set not in the dining room but in the small living room. The service was impeccable. White china, not my Chinese of course, crystal glasses, silverware, which Ennis, to my surprise, hadn't yet replaced with something more modern. "I thought it would be cozier here," Ennis explained, noticing my gaze. "The dining room is so formal for a family dinner." I nodded, deciding not to argue over trivialities. Thatcher appeared with a bottle of wine, one of the ones I kept in the cellar for special occasions. "I picked out your favorite, Mother," he said, showing me the label of a 2,000-year-old Chateau Margaux. "It cost a fortune," I remarked, but without reproach. It was nice that he remembered my preferences. "Nothing would be spared for you," Thatcher smiled, and for a moment I saw in him the boy I had raised, attentive, kind, sincere. Doris brought the first course, asparagus cream soup made to my recipe. It was a small act of resistance on her part, I knew. Ennis preferred the exotic dishes she ordered from restaurants. "Delicious, Doris," I said, tasting the soup. "Perfect as always." "A little bland," Ennis said, barely touching her plate, "but it'll do for Sunday lunch." Thatcher began to talk about a new project in his firm, the reconstruction of an old theater building in central London. I listened with sincere interest. Architecture has always been his passion, and at such moments, talking about the work, he seemed to throw off the mask of indifference, became alive, real. That's wonderful, darling, I said when he was finished. The restoration of historic buildings is such a noble task. Your father would be proud. The mention of Farley brought a fleeting shadow to Thatcher's face. He had always been afraid of failing to live up to the expectations of his father, whom he respected and somewhat feared. Farley was a demanding man, but fair, and he adored his son, though he didn't always know how to show it. Yes, I suppose so, Thatcher said uncertainly and changed the subject. How is your tobacco collection? You said you wanted to add another one, that French one? An 18th century tobacconist, I nodded, surprised and touched that he'd remembered. With a miniature of the Battle of Fontenoy. I'd been eyeing it at the Sotheby's auction, but it went for more than my limit. What a shame to spend money on old trinkets, Ennis interjected, ruining our moment of togetherness. Especially at your age, Marigold. Wouldn't it be better to spend it on something more practical? Like what? I asked, trying to remain calm. Well, I don't know. Maybe fixing up this house? Ennis circled the room. It's lovely, but it's so outdated. That wallpaper, those heavy drapes, it all looks like a museum exhibit. It is a museum of sorts, I replied. Everything here has a story, every object chosen with love and knowledge. Ennis shrugged. If you say so. But I think a little modernity wouldn't hurt. After the soup, Doris brought out the main course, roast duck with oranges, another favorite recipe of mine. By this time, Thatcher had opened a second bottle of wine, and the atmosphere had lightened a little. We talked about nothing. The movie he and Ennis had recently seen, the new exhibit at the Tate Gallery, the weather that was finally starting to resemble spring after a long gray winter. When it came to dessert, I asked Doris to bring tea. Not chamomile tea, I added with a slight smile toward Ennis. Doris returned with a tray containing cups of my favorite Earl Grey and pastries. She carefully placed the tray on the edge of the table and began pouring the tea. Let me get that for you, I said, seeing that her hands were trembling slightly. Doris had recently come down with a mild flu and was not yet fully recovered. I took the kettle and leaned over to pour the tea into the cups. I don't know what happened. Maybe my hands weren't as steady as I thought, or maybe the tablecloth shifted, but the kettle shook in my hand, and the hot tea splashed over the edge right into Ennis's lap. She shrieked and jumped up, shaking off her dress, a cream dress with intricate embroidery that probably cost more than Doris's monthly salary. Oh my God, I exclaimed, also standing up and grabbing a napkin. I'm so sorry, it was an accident. Accidental? Ennis's voice rose an octave higher. You ruined my Valentino dress. I didn't mean to. I held out the napkin, but she pushed my hand away. Of course you didn't mean to, she said through gritted teeth. How you didn't want to criticize my choice of decor. How you didn't want to remind Thatcher of his father. How you didn't want to make a fool of me in front of my friends at that dinner. Ennis, please, Thatcher intervened, stepping between us. It was just an accident. An accident? Ennis turned to him, her face contorted with anger. Your mother has been doing everything she can to make our lives difficult ever since we moved here. She's sabotaged every attempt I've made to make this house comfortable for us. This is my home, I said quietly but firmly. And I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm just trying to preserve what Farley and I have built over the years. Farley, Farley, Farley! Ennis splashed her hands. All we hear about is him. It's like time stopped when he died. But you know what, Marigold? The world moves on. People change. Houses change. Everything changes. Only you're stuck in the past, clinging to old things and memories as if they can protect you from reality. And what is reality, Ennis? I asked, feeling the anger rising up inside me in a wave. That you and my son are waiting for me to die so you can take possession of this house? That you plan to send me to a nursing home at the first opportunity? Mom, exclaimed Thatcher. How can you say such a thing? I heard you talking after that dinner, I said, looking him straight in the eye. About this house being too big for me alone, about thinking of other options. I'm neither deaf nor blind, Thatcher, though you both seem to prefer it that way. Ennis laughed. a cold, harsh laugh that made me wince. See, Thatcher? She's also eavesdropping. What more proof do you need that she's an old woman out of her mind who sees conspiracies where there aren't any? I'm not out of my mind, I said, taking a step toward her. And I won't have you talking to me like that in my own house. Your house? Ennis paused, then said slowly, with calculated cruelty, "This house will be ours sooner than you think, Marigold. And the first thing I'll do when it is ours is get rid of all this antique junk and turn it into something worthy of the 21st century." I felt the blood drain from my face. She'd said out loud what I'd suspected all along, but hearing it was like being kicked in the butt. "Over my dead body," I said quietly. "If necessary," Ennis parried with a smile that didn't affect her eyes. "Enough." Thatcher stepped between us, his face pale. "Ennis, this is unacceptable. Mom, you misunderstood our conversation. We're just worried about you, that's all." "Concerned?" I looked at him bitterly. "You call that worrying? Your wife systematically forces me out of my own home, humiliates me in front of guests, changes things without my permission, and you just stand by and watch." "She's exaggerating as always," Ennis said, addressing Thatcher as if I wasn't in the room. "See why I said we need to think seriously about her condition? This paranoia, these accusations." "I'm not paranoid," I exclaimed, my patience finally breaking. "And I will not allow you to treat me like I'm incapacitated." I stepped toward Ennis again, intending to tell her everything I'd been saying for months. But my gesture was too harsh, and I accidentally touched her hand, still wet with tea. "Don't you dare touch me!" Ennis shouted. And before I knew what was happening, her hand was up, and I felt a burning pain on my cheek. The slap was so sudden that I staggered and grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. There was dead silence in the room. Doris, who was standing in the doorway, gasped and put her hand to her mouth. I slowly raised my hand to my burning cheek, unable to believe that this had really happened. That this woman, my son's wife, had dared to raise her hand against me in my own home. "Thatcher," I said quietly, turning to my son, expecting his reaction, his defense, his outrage. But Thatcher stood, eyes downcast, his arms hanging powerlessly along his body. He didn't look at me or Ennis, as if he hoped that if he avoided our gaze long enough, somehow it would all go away. "Ennis," he finally said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. "You shouldn't have done that." "You shouldn't have?" I questioned, not believing my ears. "Your wife hit your mother and you say you shouldn't have done it?" "She provoked me," Ennis said quickly, her voice suddenly pitiful, almost whiny. "You saw her try to attack me. I was just defending myself." "That's not true," I exclaimed. "I didn't—" "Mom, please." Thatcher held up his hand, stopping me. "Let's all just calm down. This situation is out of control. Ennis shouldn't have hit you, but you were also emotional." I couldn't believe my ears. My son, my only child, the one I'd raised alone since Farley's death, the one I'd given everything to, my time, my love, my savings, was standing in front of me and actually justifying the woman who just slapped me. "Are you defending her?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange even to myself. Too calm, too detached, as if this wasn't happening to me, but to someone else. "I'm not defending, I'm just trying to be objective." Thatcher finally looked up, but he was looking not at me, but somewhere over my head. "You both behaved unreasonably." "Unreasonable," I repeated slowly, tasting the word. "It's unreasonable to demand respect in your own home. It's unreasonable to expect my own son to take my side when his wife insults and humiliates me." "Mom, you're dramatizing everything." Thatcher sighed. "Ennis is just trying to help, to make this house more comfortable for all of us. And you take her every suggestion as a personal insult." "Help?" I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "Ennis is not interested in my well-being, Thatcher. She's only interested in this house and what she can do with it when I'm gone. See?" Ennis turned to Thatcher, her face contorted in a grimace of feigned compassion. "This is what I was talking about. This paranoia, these accusations. Your mother needs help, Thatcher. Professional help." "The only help I need," I said, looking directly at Ennis, "is for both of you to leave my house. Ennis opened her mouth in feigned surprise, then turned to Thatcher with an I told you so look on her face. Mom, you can't be serious, Thatcher began, but I interrupted him. I am dead serious. I want you both to pack your things and leave. Tonight. This is insane, Ennis exclaimed. Thatcher, tell her it's crazy. Thatcher sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he always did when he was upset or embarrassed. Mom, we can't leave today, you know that. The renovations on our apartment aren't finished yet. And renovations that have been going on for 6 months? I interrupted. It's weird that it's taken so long. It's almost like it never happened. Of course it had. Thatcher was outraged. There were just complications and… Enough lies, I said tiredly. I know that from the very beginning you planned to stay here forever. Temporarily at first, then gradually push me out and then… What? A nursing home? A little apartment somewhere on the outskirts, out of sight? While you split my inheritance? Mom! Thatcher looked genuinely shocked, but I couldn't believe his reactions anymore. How can you think that way about us? How am I supposed to think that? I asked. After everything that's happened in these months? After what happened today? I touched my cheek again, still burning from the blow. Ennis looked at me without a shadow of remorse, only with cold calculation in her eyes. If you don't leave today, I said, straightening to my full height, I'll change my will. It was a random shot, but it hit the target. I saw Ennis flinch and Thatcher turn even paler. Mom, let's not talk about these things, he said conciliatory. We're all tired and upset. Why don't we postpone this conversation until tomorrow when we've all calmed down? No, I shook my head. I won't. Not after your wife hit me and you just stood there and watched. I turned and headed for the door. Where are you going? Thatcher asked. To Orion Proud, I answered without turning around. My attorney. Now? Thatcher asked incredulously. Mom, it's Sunday night. He won't be. He will come, I said firmly. Orion always comes when I call him. It was true. Orion Proud wasn't just my attorney. He'd been a family friend for decades, someone Farley trusted implicitly, and the only one who knew everything about our finances and legal affairs. I left the room, leaving Thatcher and Ennis in stunned silence. Walking up to my office, I closed the door and sank into my chair, feeling the strength suddenly leave me. My hand went to my cheek again, and I was surprised to find tears streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of determination. Ennis's slap hadn't just been a physical blow. It had been the last straw, a moment of clarity. Now I knew exactly what I had to do. I reached for the phone and dialed Orion's number. Orion didn't arrive right away. He called, apologized, and said he couldn't be at my place until tomorrow morning. Don't make any decisions in haste, Marigold, he advised in his measured, soothing voice. I promised to wait until morning, but I didn't promise not to think. Night enveloped my mansion like an inky cloud. I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the heating system. All these sounds, familiar and familiar, now seemed alienated, as if the house were turning away from me, preferring the new owners. I got up, threw on my robe, and went to the window. Westminster was asleep, with only the sparse windows glowing in the darkness and the street lamps casting ghostly circles of light on the sidewalk. Somewhere out there, beyond those walls, was another world, a world I'd once felt confident in, a world that now seemed distant and inaccessible. My cheek was still throbbing slightly from the slap. Not so much from the physical pain, the blow hadn't been hard, but from the humiliation, from the realization that my daughter-in-law had dared to raise her hand against me and my son hadn't stood up for me. How did we get to this point? Where had I taken a wrong turn that Thatcher had grown so indifferent? I opened the drawer of my bedside table and pulled out an old photo album in a worn leather binding. Farley had always made fun of my habit of keeping physical photos in the digital age. Why do you need those dusty albums when you can store thousands of pictures on your computer? He asked. But I've always believed that real photos, the ones you can hold in your hands, have a special magic. They store not only the images, but also the touch and emotions of those who held them. The first picture in the album is of Farley and me on our wedding day. Me in a simple white dress, him in a dark suit, both so young, so full of hope. It was the year 1970. I was only 21, he was 26. He was just beginning his diplomatic career. I was finishing my university studies, specializing in art history. We met at an exhibition of French Impressionists. I was standing in front of a Monet painting, completely absorbed in the play of light and color, when I heard a deep voice with a slight accent. I wonder what he really saw. These patches of color or a complete image. I turned and saw a tall man with attentive gray eyes and a slight smile. We talked until the gallery closed, then continued on to a nearby cafe, and by the end of the evening, I knew I had met the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Farley wasn't just a diplomat. He was a Renaissance man interested in art, literature, and philosophy. From him, I learned about political intrigue in the corridors of power, the intricacies of international relations, and the art of compromise. In return, I opened up the world of antiques to him, taught him to see the history captured in objects, to understand the language of form and material. I turned the page. Here we are in Paris, where Farley got his first serious assignment. I'm wearing a wide-brimmed hat, laughing, and he has his arm around my shoulders. We were so happy in those years, so full of enthusiasm. I got a job at a small gallery on the left bank, where I gave tours to tourists and helped with art appraisals. In the evenings, we wandered the narrow streets of Paris, dined in small bistros, and dreamed of the future. It was in Paris that I realized I was pregnant. Farley was on a business trip to Brussels when I got the results of the tests. I couldn't wait for him to return and called him from the doctor's office. "We're having a baby," I said, and there was a pause in the receiver. For a moment, I was afraid he wasn't happy, but then I heard his voice breaking with excitement. "Marigold, this is the most wonderful news in the world." The next picture is of me in a hospital room with a tiny bundle in my arms. Thatcher was born on a spring morning after a long 18 hours of labor. Farley was by my side the whole time, holding my hand, telling me I was the strongest woman he knew. As the nurse placed our son on my chest, I saw tears streaming down Farley's face. "He's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching Thatcher's tiny hand. We'd named him Thatcher in honor of Farley's grandfather, an explorer who'd spent half his life studying Middle Eastern cultures. Farley hoped his son would inherit his passion for learning, his curiosity about the world. In a way, that's what happened. Thatcher was always an inquisitive child, but his interests lay on a different plane. He loved constructors, could spend hours building complex structures out of blocks, and as he grew older, he started drawing buildings, bridges, skyscrapers, castles. I flipped through a few pages. Here's Thatcher on her first bicycle, with a big smile and skinned knees. Here we are as a family in Venice. Thatcher is about 10, feeding pigeons in Piazza San Marco. Here's his elementary school graduation. He's standing proudly erect, diploma in hand, and Farley and I are on either side of him, so proud, so happy. The life of a diplomat meant constant traveling. In the first 15 years of Thatcher's life, we changed 5 countries: Paris, Rome, Cairo, London again, then Tokyo. Each move was a new challenge for him, a new school, new friends, a new language. I could see how hard it was for him, how he withdrew into himself after each farewell to another friend. Farley said it builds character, teaches you to adapt, but I was worried. Maybe that's when I started overprotecting him, trying to compensate for the instability of our life. When Thatcher turned 16, Farley and I made a difficult decision. Farley was assigned to Singapore, but I decided to stay in London with Thatcher so that he could finish school without changing the educational system before going to university. It was the beginning of our two-home life. Farley would visit when he could. Thatcher and I would fly over for vacations, but most of the time I was alone with my teenage son. I stopped at a photograph taken at the time. Thatcher is in the uniform of a prestigious private school, me next to him, and we are standing in front of this very house, my current home, which we bought when we decided to settle in London. Farley is not in the picture. He was taking pictures during one of his short visits. These were difficult years. Thatcher was going through a turbulent teenage period, and I was trying to combine being a single mother with developing my own career. By then, I had already established myself as an antiques expert, specializing in miniatures and 18th century decorative arts. I worked as a consultant in several auction houses, wrote articles for specialized magazines, began to collect my collection. There was always enough money. Farley's salary was decent, and my income from consulting was gradually growing. But time was woefully short. I missed parent-teacher conferences because of the auctions. I couldn't always help Thatcher with his homework, and I was often too tired for the long conversations he probably wanted to have with me. I compensated for this financially. If Thatcher expressed interest in something, I immediately bought it, whether it was an expensive designer, computer games, or art classes. When he wanted to go with the class on a field trip to Rome, I not only paid for the trip, but also organized for him and his friends a private tour of closed-to-tourist parts of the Vatican, using Farley's connections. On Thatcher's 18th birthday, I gave him his first car, not the most expensive, but prestigious and stylish. Farley thought it was overkill that we were spoiling the boy, but I insisted. He deserves the best, I said then, and Farley relented as he almost always did when it came to Thatcher. I turned a few more pages. Here was Thatcher receiving his diploma from the Architectural Association, one of the most prestigious schools of architecture in the world. Farley and I were both present at the ceremony, proud and touched. Thatcher was glowing, holding the diploma, for which we paid a considerable sum. Then came his first steps into the profession. I used all my connections to help him get a job with a good architectural firm. Farley had retired by then, and we were finally living together again in this very house. Thatcher would often come over for dinner, talking about his projects, his colleagues, his ambitions. He dreamed of opening his own studio, and Farley and I discussed how we could help him financially. And then Ennis showed up. I flipped through the album to a picture from their wedding. Thatcher in a tuxedo, Ennis in a lush white dress that I now realize cost more than they could afford. They met at a fundraiser sponsored by Thatcher's architectural firm. Ennis worked in public relations, organizing events for wealthy clients. She was, and still is, a beautiful woman. Tall, slender, with impeccable taste and impeccable manners. At least that's how it seemed at first. Farley immediately disliked her. "There's something false about her," he said to me after the first meeting. But I brushed aside his misgivings. I saw how happy Thatcher, how he blossoms around her, becomes more confident. And then she was really charming. Interested in my collections, listened to Farley's stories about the diplomatic service, brought small gifts when she came to dinner. The wedding was lavish and expensive. Farley and I paid most of the expenses, though Ennis insisted on certain details that increased the budget considerably. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing," she said, and I agreed, though Farley frowned as he looked over the bills. After the wedding, we'd given them a substantial sum for a down payment on an apartment, the very apartment that was supposedly still being renovated. I closed the album and put it back in the nightstand. The last pictures were too painful. Farley in a hospital room, gaunt but still trying to smile. His diagnosis came as a thunderclap to us. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. 6 months, a year tops, the doctor said, avoiding looking us in the eye. Farley lived 8 months. 8 months of gradual fading, pain that was increasingly difficult to control, and talk, endless talk about the past, about the future, about what really mattered. "Take care of Thatcher," he told me one of the last days. "But don't let him or anyone else run your life. You're stronger than you think, Marigold." I wasn't sure of that then. When Farley was gone, I felt lost, devastated. Thatcher and Ennis supported me for the first few weeks, but then went back to their lives. I immersed myself in my work, spending my days at auctions and appraisals, trying to fill the void. And then 6 months ago, they showed up on my doorstep with suitcases and announced renovations to their apartment. I was glad for the company, glad to have family around me again. How quickly that joy turned to bitterness. I walked over to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, the pre-dawn twilight coloring the horizon a soft pink. I'd spent all night reminiscing, and now that morning was inexorably approaching. I saw everything with piercing clarity. I had always given too much to Thatcher and demanded too little in return. I have compensated for his lack of time with money and gifts, allowed him to think the world exists for his convenience. I've created a man who thinks he owes everyone, who sees nothing wrong with his wife insulting and humiliating his mother. And Ennis, I realize now that Farley was right. There was always something false about her, something predatory. She saw Thatcher not so much as a husband as a means of access to our fortune, to this house, to the life she thought she deserved. The ringing of the phone snapped me out of my musings. It was Orion, informing me that he would be at my place in an hour. I showered, dressed, and went down to the kitchen to make tea. The house was quiet. Thatcher and Ennis must still be asleep, or avoiding me. It didn't matter. My decision had been made. When I heard the doorbell ring, I felt the strange calm that comes with complete clarity. I knew what I had to do, and I was prepared for the consequences. Doris, faithful Doris, ushered Orion into my office. He walked in, tall and straight despite his 70-plus years, carrying a scuffed leather briefcase that I remembered seemingly all my life. "Good morning, Marigold," he said, and his deep voice was like an anchor in the raging sea of my emotions. "You wanted to see me on urgent business?" "Yes, Orion," I replied, pointing to the chair across from me. "I want to change my will." Orion Proud sat comfortably in the chair opposite, resting his old-fashioned leather briefcase on his lap. The morning light streaming in through the high windows of my office emphasized the deep wrinkles on his face, the map of a long life of experience and wisdom. "Change the will," he repeated thoughtfully, showing neither surprise nor disapproval. "May I ask what prompted the decision?" I touched my cheek, which still held the ghostly sensation of yesterday's slap. "There was an incident yesterday," I began, trying to speak calmly and objectively, as if I were talking about someone else's life. "My daughter-in-law Ennis slapped me in the face during a family dinner. My son did not stand up for me. In fact, he justified her actions." Orion tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharper. "That's a serious accusation, Marigold." "It's not an accusation, Orion, it's a fact." I straightened in my chair. "And it's just the culmination of months of humiliation and neglect on their part. They moved into my house 6 months ago, ostensibly temporarily, because of renovations to their apartment. Since then, Ennis has been methodically trying to force me out of my own life, changing the furnishings without my permission, bossing around my servants, humiliating me in front of my guests." I stopped, feeling the anger rising inside me again. I took a deep breath. I'd spent a sleepless night thinking about my life, about my relationship with Thatcher. I realized I'd always indulged him too much, always given more than I demanded in return. And the result is a man who can watch his wife insult his mother and see nothing wrong with it. Orion listened without interrupting, his face impassive, but I could see understanding and sympathy in his eyes. "I understand your feelings, Marigold," he said at last. "But changing your will is a serious step. Are you sure you're not making this decision in a state of emotional distress?" "I've never been so sure of anything," I answered firmly. "It's not an impulsive reaction, Orion. It's the result of much thought. I don't want my inheritance to go to people who don't respect me and everything I've created." Orion nodded and opened his briefcase, taking out a notepad and pen. "In that case, let's discuss the details. What are your wishes for the new will?" I walked over to the window, looking out at the morning Westminster. Peaceful, elegant, timeless. The view always soothed me, reminding me of continuity, of how life goes on even after us. "My home," I began, turning to Orion. "I don't want Thatcher and Ennis to have it. I want it to go to the city, to be a museum and estate. A Victorian mansion with original furnishings and a collection of antiques. I think it would be interesting and educational for the public." Orion recorded my words without commenting. "As for my collection of antiques," I continued, "I want to leave most of it to Adeline Crane." "Adeline?" Orion raised his eyebrows. "Your neighbor?" "Yes," I smiled, thinking of the young woman who had become closer to me than my own family in recent years. "She's a talented restorer, with a deep understanding and respect for the past. She will appreciate these things not only for their material value, but for the history they hold." I walked back to my chair and sat down, gathering my thoughts. I also want to leave her the little cottage in Surrey, the one I inherited from Aunt Vivian. Adeline has always dreamed of having her own workshop in the country where she could work in peace and quiet. Orion nodded, making notes. And the funds? As I recall, we're talking about a considerable sum, including Farley's inheritance and your own savings from your work as an expert. I sighed. This was the most difficult question of all. Despite all the pain and disappointment, Thatcher was still my son, my flesh and blood. To completely disinherit him seemed too cruel. I want the bulk of it to go toward a scholarship fund for art students, I said after a pause. The Farley Winslet Fund. He always believed in the power of education, in the importance of supporting young talent. I paused again, inwardly struggling with conflicting feelings. To Thatcher and Ennis, I leave a small monthly allowance, enough to live comfortably, but not luxuriously. And Thatcher's personal belongings, which are still stored here, his childhood drawings, school awards, family photo albums. It all belongs to him by right. But there's a condition, I added, my voice hardening. This maintenance will be paid only on the condition that they never set foot in my house again. Not in my lifetime, not after my death. Orion looked up from his notebook, his gaze serious and attentive. Do you realize that such a stipulation could be challenged in a court of law? Let them try, I replied bitterly. You have a recording of our conversation from last night, where I mentioned the slap incident. I'm sure Doris would also be willing to testify about what happened. Besides, I smiled slightly, I'm not going to die anytime soon, Orion. I still have time to make sure my will is legally flawless. Orion nodded and continued making notes. When he was done, he looked up and asked, Is there anything else you would like to include in your will? I thought for a moment. Yes, a small item. I want my collection of Chinese porcelain, the one that Ennis so unceremoniously put away in the pantry, to be displayed in the main living room of the museum, with a plaque explaining its history and significance. It was a petty gesture, I knew, but I couldn't help myself. A small, posthumous revenge for all the humiliation I'd had to endure. Orion closed the notebook and tucked it away in his briefcase. I'll have all the necessary paperwork ready by tomorrow. But let me give you some advice, not as a lawyer, but as a friend who has known you and your family for many years. Decisions like this can lead to an irreversible breakdown in a relationship. Are you sure you want that? I looked at the picture of Farley on my desk, at his smart, kind face that had always been my compass in difficult times. The breakup has already happened, Orion, I said quietly. Yesterday, when Thatcher was silent when his wife slapped me across the face, I'm just formalizing it legally. Orion nodded, accepting my decision. He stood up, about to leave, but stopped at the door. You mentioned the formal reading of the will. It's an unusual practice these days. Are you sure you want it? Absolutely, I replied. I want them to hear every word, every condition. I want to see their faces when they realize the consequences of their actions. After Orion left, I stayed in the office, feeling strangely empty. The decision had been made, the mechanism had been set in motion, but it didn't feel any better. I still felt the pain of betrayal, the bitterness of realizing that the man I'd raised was capable of such callousness. The sound of the front door opening brought me out of my reverie. Light footsteps, Doris's voice greeting someone, and then the familiar, melodious laughter of Adeline. I stepped out of the study and down the hall. Adeline stood there, bright as ever in her colorful dress, with her hair gathered in a careless bun, and a smile that always warmed my heart. Marigold! She rushed to me, embracing me with the directness that had always charmed me. I brought those books on Japanese lacquer technique I promised. They're amazing, you should… She stopped, noticing the look on my face, and her smile changed to concern. What's wrong? Are you okay? I tried to smile, but it wasn't convincing. Let's go into the conservatory, I suggested. It would be more comfortable to talk there. The winter garden was my favorite place in the house. A bright room with panoramic windows overlooking a small but well-maintained garden. Here, among the lush greenery and the fragrance of flowers, I always felt closer to nature, to life in its purest form. We sat down in the wicker chairs, and Doris brought us tea, real Earl Grey, not the herbal concoction Ennis had been pushing. So what happened? Adeline asked when Doris came out. You look exhausted. I told her about yesterday's incident, about the slap, about Thatcher's silence, about my decision to change the will. Adeline listened without interrupting, her usually animated face growing more serious with every word I said. My God, Marigold, she said when I'd finished. It's awful. How could they do this to you? I shook my head, feeling the tears I'd been holding back all morning finally find their way out. I don't know, Adeline. I thought I knew my son, but now I'm not sure I ever knew him. Adeline moved to the chair beside me and took my hands in hers. The young, strong hands of a restorer, with light traces of solvents and paint, with short, practiced nails. You don't deserve to be treated like this, she said firmly. No one does. I squeezed her hands, grateful for this simple human support. You know, I said after a pause, I've included you in my new will. Adeline recoiled, her eyes widening in surprise. Me? But why? Because you deserve it, I answered simply. Because you understand the value of the past. Because you respect history and tradition. Because you remind me of myself when I was young. As passionate, as committed to my work. I didn't tell her the details. It would have seemed tactless, as if I were buying her friendship or gratitude. But the truth was that over the past 2 years, since Adeline had moved in next door and had come to meet me with a gift of homemade cookies, she had become almost the daughter I never had. We met by chance. She rang my doorbell to ask if I minded the construction noise from her house where she was setting up a workshop. Not only did I not mind, but I invited her in for tea, intrigued by this young woman with a paint stain on her cheek and a determined look. Over tea, it transpired that Adeline was an antique furniture restorer specializing in the Victorian era. She studied at the London College of Furniture, then interned at various museums before deciding to start her own business. I showed her my collection, and her delight was genuine. She saw not only the material value of things, but also their history, their character, their soul. She could talk for hours about the marquetry techniques of an 18th century chest of drawers or the lacquering of a Meiji Japanese table. We saw each other regularly from then on. Adeline often came to me with questions about restoration, showed me photos of her work, and asked for advice. I shared my knowledge, my contacts in the world of antiques, and my stories with her. Sometimes we went to auctions or exhibitions together. Watching Adeline at such times was pure pleasure. Her enthusiasm, her knowledge, her ability to see the beauty in details that most people just didn't notice. Gradually, our relationship grew from professional to personal. We talked not only about antiques, but also about life, about our joys and sorrows. Adeline told about her childhood in a small town in the north, about her parents who did not understand her passion for old things, about an unsuccessful affair with an artist who was more interested in her connections than in herself. I shared memories of life with Farley, of the difficulties of raising a child while constantly moving, of my professional triumphs and failures. Adeline listened with genuine interest, asked questions, and offered her perspective, fresh, young, but always respectful of my experience. After Farley's death, it was Adeline who was there for me, supporting me not with loud words of sympathy but with a quiet presence, practical help, and the ability to distract me from my gloomy thoughts with conversations about art and beauty. When Thatcher and Ennis moved in with me, our meetings with Adeline became less frequent, partly because Ennis made it quite clear that she thought our friendship was strange and inappropriate. What could you possibly have in common with that girl? She asked with a slight sneer. Aren't we the ones you should be spending your time with? But we still found ways to see each other, on days when Thatcher and Ennis were away on business, or at a cafe nearby, or in Adeline's studio, where I could watch her work for hours, marveling at the precision of her movements, her patience, her respect for the material. I don't know what to say. Adeline's voice brought me back to reality. I didn't expect, I didn't think, you don't need to say anything, I replied softly. I don't expect thanks or any special words. I just wanted you to know. Adeline shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's not about gratitude, Marigold. It's just, you mean so much to me. More than just a mentor or a friend. You're, she hesitated for words. You showed me that I could be what I wanted to be, that my passion for old things wasn't an oddity but a calling. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Tears were now streaming down her cheeks, and I reached up to wipe them away. You remind me of the daughter I never had, I said quietly. Smart, talented, with a heart open to beauty and history. You deserve everything I can give you. We sat like that for a few minutes in silence, broken only by the birds singing in the garden and the distant noise of the city. Then Adeline straightened up, wiped away her tears, and smiled. That bright, determined smile that was her trademark. What are you going to do next? She asked. With Thatcher and Ennis, I mean. I sighed, coming back to reality, which was far less pleasant than our conversation. Orion is preparing the paperwork. Tomorrow we'll have the formal reading of the will. I want them to hear every word, every stipulation. That won't be easy, Adeline remarked. They probably won't take it well. No doubt, I agreed. There will be yelling, accusations, maybe even threats. But I'm ready for it. I no longer have any illusions about their true nature. I felt the resolve that had sustained me all morning strengthen again. Yes, it will be difficult. Yes, it will be painful. But it is necessary, not only as an act of justice, but as an act of self-respect. Will you be there for me? I asked Adeline. Tomorrow, during the announcement? She nodded without hesitation. Of course. I'll be there for as long as it takes. I squeezed her hand, grateful for that unconditional support. In a world where even my own son could betray me, that kind of loyalty was priceless. Thank you, I said simply. For everything. We finished our tea and Adeline left, promising to return tomorrow at the appointed time. I stayed in the winter garden, watching the light play in the leaves, thinking about the day ahead. Orion called in the evening to say that the papers were ready, and he would arrive at 11 in the morning for the announcement. I thanked him and asked Doris to tell Thatcher and Ennis that their presence in the library at that time was mandatory. They've been asking about you all day, ma'am, Doris said with concern. Mr. Thatcher looked very worried. Let him worry, I replied. Tomorrow everything will be clearer. I spent the evening in my office looking through old catalogs of auctions I'd participated in, rereading articles I'd written for antiques magazines. This was my life, full of passion, knowledge, discovery. A life that Ennis called stuck in the past. Perhaps she was right about one thing. I do value the past, but not because I fear the future, but because I see the past as the foundation for the present, the roots without which the tree cannot stand. When the clock struck midnight, I closed the last catalog and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would be a difficult day, and I needed the strength to face it with dignity. As I fell asleep, I thought not of Thatcher and Ennis, not of the pain of betrayal or the bitterness of disappointment. I thought of Adeline, of her young bright face, of her hands carefully restoring the beauty of antique things, of her eyes full of admiration for the craftsmanship of past generations. Perhaps this is the real continuity, not in blood or name, but in a shared passion, in a shared understanding of the value of the past, in a shared respect for history and tradition. And if so, I have found my true heiress. The morning of the announcement of the will was unexpectedly clear and sunny, as if nature itself decided to support me on this difficult day. I woke up early after a surprisingly restful sleep and spent an hour carefully selecting an outfit. I settled on the dark blue suit that Farley had always called my diplomatic attire. It made me look collected, elegant, and, most important, unyielding. Doris brought breakfast to my room, an unaccustomed luxury I'd allowed myself in order to avoid a premature meeting with Thatcher and Ennis. According to Doris, they were both at home, tense and silent, exchanging only brief phrases over breakfast. Mr. Thatcher asked about you, ma'am, Doris said, setting the cups down. He wanted to know if you'd changed your mind about the meeting. No, Doris, I said, buttering my toast. I haven't changed my mind. This meeting is inevitable. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Adeline arrived. She was dressed more formally than usual, in a simple dress of muted green, with a minimum of accessories. Her usually loose hair was gathered into a neat bundle, making her look more serious and older than her 27 years. "Do I look solid enough?" she asked with a slight smile, noticing my appraising gaze. I wanted to match the importance of the moment. "You look beautiful," I replied sincerely. "Thank you for coming." We walked to my office, away from prying eyes, and spent the next hour talking quietly about Adeline's latest restoration projects, the V&A exhibition, anything but the upcoming announcement. It was our way of dealing with the tension, talking about normal, everyday things as if this day was no different. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Doris escorted Orion Proud into the library, where, at my direction, chairs had already been prepared and arranged around a large oak table. The desk where Farley had once written his memoirs, where Thatcher had done his homework as a child, where I had spent many hours studying auction catalogs and antiques guides. Adeline and I walked down to the library, where Orion was already unfolding papers from his worn leather briefcase. He nodded to us, his face serious and collected, the professional mask he wore before important meetings. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. "The paperwork has been drawn up according to your wishes and is in full compliance with the law." I nodded and sat in the chair at the head of the table, a position I had held at family councils for decades. Adeline sat to my left, Orion to my right. It was left to wait for Thatcher and Ennis. They appeared a few minutes later. Thatcher looked tense but held himself upright, with the dignity Farley had taught him. Ennis, on the other hand, seemed agitated and annoyed at the same time. Her gaze slid to me, then to Adeline, and there was a look of mild contempt on her face. "What is she doing here?" Ennis asked, nodding toward Adeline. "This is a family matter." "Adeline is here at my invitation," I replied calmly. "Please sit down." Thatcher touched Ennis's arm, warning her not to start an argument, and they sat down across from us. There was an awkward pause, which Orion interrupted by clearing his throat. "Thank you all for your presence," he began in a formal tone. "We are here at the request of Mrs. Marigold Winslet for the reading of her new will, made and signed yesterday, June 8, 2025. Ennis cast a quick glance at Thatcher, something akin to triumph flashing in her eyes. They thought I'd called them to tell them I'd decided to sign the house over to them, maybe even to move into that little cottage in Surrey that Ennis had casually mentioned in conversation. "Before we begin," Orion continued, "I would like to point out that Mrs. Winslet is in perfect health and clear mind, as confirmed by Dr. Harmon's medical report of yesterday. This will is made with full understanding of its implications and in accordance with all legal requirements." Ennis's smile began to fade and Thatcher straightened in his chair, his face tense. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked directly. "What's all this for?" I looked at my son, the only child I loved more than life, for whom I had sacrificed my dreams and ambitions, to whom I had given the best I had. "Patience, Thatcher," I said calmly. "You'll know soon enough." Orion put on his glasses and began to read. "I, Marigold Elizabeth Winslet, being of sound mind and sound judgment, do hereby revoke and annul all previous wills and dispose of my estate as follows." The faces of Thatcher and Ennis gradually changed as Orion read out the clauses of the will. First bewilderment, then alarm, then, when he reached the clause about turning the mansion over to the city for an estate museum, pure, unconcealed shock. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ennis interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "You can't be serious." "Please don't interrupt, Mrs. Winslet," Orion said sternly. "You will have a chance to speak after the entire document has been read." Ennis leaned back in her chair, her face contorted with ill-concealed rage. Thatcher sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Orion continued reading. When he reached the paragraph about the transfer of the antiques collection and the cottage in Surrey to Adeline Crane, Ennis couldn't stand it. "To her?" she exclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at Adeline. "You are leaving your precious treasures to this girl who appeared out of nowhere? You're out of your mind." "Ennis," Thatcher said warningly, but it was too late. "Don't you dare shut me up!" She turned to him, her face red with anger. "Don't you realize what's going on? Your mother is disinheriting us in favor of some strange girl. Everything that should have been ours." "Mrs. Winslet," Orion raised his voice, "I'm going to have to ask you to keep order or I'll have to interrupt the reading." To hell with your announcement. Ennis jumped up from her seat. This is a farce. That old witch is out of her mind if she thinks she can do this to us. Ennis! Thatcher now rose, grabbing her arm. Stop it! You're making it worse! I watched the scene with remarkable calm. It was like watching a play in a theater. Emotional, but not about me personally. Adeline sat beside me, pale but collected. Her hand slipped discreetly to mine under the table, and I squeezed her fingers gratefully. Maybe we should take a break, Orion suggested, looking at me. No, I replied firmly. Please continue. I want everything to be said today. Ennis sat down again, glaring at me with a hateful look. Thatcher put a hand on her shoulder either to soothe her or to keep her from erupting again. Orion continued reading. When he reached the paragraph about the Farley Winslet Memorial Scholarship Fund, I noticed Thatcher's face tremble. He loved his father, always striving to earn his approval. Did he know how deeply disappointed Farley would be by his current behavior? Finally, Orion reached the last clause, that of monthly maintenance for Thatcher and Ennis, on the condition that they never cross the threshold of my house again. This condition is not negotiable or amendable, Orion read out. Should Thatcher Farley Winslet or his wife Ennis Maria Winslet violate this condition, payments will be stopped immediately, and all funds intended for them will be transferred to the aforementioned scholarship fund. There was a silence so profound you could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Orion folded the papers and removed his glasses. This concludes the reading of Mrs. Marigold Winslet's will. Are there any questions? Questions! Ennis laughed, a hoarse, unnatural laugh. I have only one question. How could you allow this? This farce was legalized. She is clearly out of her mind. I have already pointed out, Mrs. Winslet, that the medical report confirms your mother-in-law's full capacity, Orion replied calmly. Moreover, as her attorney for over 30 years, I can personally attest to her clarity of mind. This is ridiculous, Ennis turned to Thatcher. Say something. This is your mother, your inheritance. Thatcher slowly raised his eyes, and I saw in them a strange mixture of emotions, anger, confusion, and maybe even a glimmer of understanding. Mother, he said quietly, addressing me for the first time since we'd met. Why? Is it because of what happened at lunch? Because of what Ennis? Don't you dare accuse me, Ennis interrupted him. She started the whole thing. She spilled tea on me on purpose to ruin my dress. That's enough. I stood up, and everyone stopped talking. I didn't make this decision yesterday or the day before yesterday. It had been maturing in me for months as I watched you two gradually try to push me out of my own life. Yesterday's incident was just the last straw. I looked right at Thatcher. You are my son, and I will always love you. But I can't respect a man who watches silently as his wife insults and humiliates his mother, who justifies a slap in the face by saying I was emotional, who is willing to betray his family, his heritage for the sake of, what? Modern decor? New china that can be washed in the dishwasher? Thatcher lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze. It's your choice, Thatcher, I continued, and these are its consequences. You'll have enough money to live comfortably, but not in luxury, not at my expense, and not in this house that you and your wife so obviously disrespect. I turned to Ennis, who was looking at me with undisguised hatred. As for you, Ennis, I have nothing to say to you. You have never been a part of this family, not in the sense that matters. You only saw us as a means to your ends, status, money, this house, but you miscalculated. The Winslets may be too kind, too trusting, but we are not fools, and we don't let anyone raise a hand against us with impunity. I took Adeline's hand and helped her up. This meeting is over. Orion, thank you for your time and professionalism. Doris will show you out. You can't just leave, Ennis shouted, jumping up again. We're going to contest that will. We'll prove that you're insane. You can try, Orion replied calmly, gathering the documents. But I assure you, this will is legally flawless, and any attempt to challenge it will only lead to a public scandal, which I'm sure is not in your best interests. To hell with my interests! Ennis grabbed one of the documents from the table and tore it open. I'm not going to let some out-of-my-mind old woman and her little friend take away what is rightfully ours. Ennis, that's enough. Thatcher grabbed her hands, trying to calm her down. You're only making it worse. Let me go. She broke free and pointed a trembling finger at Adeline. And you little fraud, you think you can just come and take everything we deserve? Adeline, who had remained silent until now, raised her head and looked directly at Ennis. I asked for nothing and expected nothing, she said quietly but firmly. Marigold made her own decision, and I respect it, whatever it may be. Hypocrite, Ennis spat out. You've been manipulating her for months, ingratiating yourself with her. Enough! My voice, suddenly loud and harsh, silenced everyone. I will not stand by and listen to you insult a man I deeply respect. If you have nothing constructive to say, I suggest you leave this room, and tomorrow, this house. Mom, Thatcher stepped forward, his voice sounding almost pleading. Let's talk. Just you and me, without Ennis, without... He cast a glance at Adeline. No outsiders, I'm sure we can work this out. No, Thatcher, I shook my head. It's too late to talk. You made your choice when you kept your mouth shut after slapping Ennis, when you excused her behavior, when you let her slowly push me out of my own home. I headed for the door, Adeline following me. The documents that will remain in your possession are copies, Orion said, gathering his briefcase. The originals are kept in a safe place. I would advise you to think carefully about your next steps. We left the library, leaving Thatcher and Ennis in stunned silence. Orion said goodbye to us in the lobby, promising to be in touch if his help was needed. I felt strangely light, as if I'd shed a heavy weight I'd been carrying for too long. Adeline offered to stay with me, but I declined. I need some time to myself, I said, squeezing her hand. But thank you for your support. You don't know how much it means to me. After she left, I headed for the conservatory, my favorite place in the house, an oasis of calm and beauty. Doris brought me tea, real Earl Grey, strong and fragrant, just the way I like it. I sat in the wicker chair, watching the light play in the foliage, enjoying the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I felt like a mistress in my own home, in my own life. After a while, I heard a noise from the hallway, Ennis's loud, furious voice, interrupted by Thatcher's quieter but insistent remarks. The sound of breaking glass, then sobs, hysterical, full of rage and frustration. Hush, dear, we'll find a way, Thatcher's voice came to me. We'll talk to a lawyer, we'll... Talk about what? Ennis shouted. That old witch has taken everything from us, everything. And for what? To give it to some random girl and a bunch of unknown students? She's still my mother. Thatcher's voice sounded tired. And she has the right to dispose of her property as she wishes. She's crazy, sobbed Ennis. And if you can't see that, then you're as crazy as she is. We must fight. We must contest this will. No, Ennis, Thatcher said firmly. Orion is right. Any attempt to contest the will only lead to a scandal. We'll get a monthly allowance. That's enough to... Enough? Ennis laughed hysterically. It's crumbs, handouts, when we could have it all. Her voice trailed off into a shout. Then there was the sound of footsteps, the slam of a door, and then silence again. I took a sip of my tea, surprised at my calmness. I expected to feel pain, bitterness, maybe even regret. But instead, there was only quiet satisfaction at the decision I'd made and a sense of closure. I knew Thatcher and Ennis would be leaving soon, if not today, then tomorrow. I knew they would be angry, perhaps even try to contest the will despite Orion's warning. But that didn't matter anymore. I had protected what was dear to me, my home, my heritage, my dignity. I sat in the conservatory, quietly sipping tea, listening to Ennis sobbing with rage somewhere in the back of the house as Thatcher tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. It was the end of one chapter of my life, but not life itself. There were many days ahead filled with new meaning, working on the museum, socializing with Adeline, perhaps even new acquisitions for my collection. Doris entered with a tray of fresh scones. Is everything all right, ma'am? She asked anxiously. There's so much noise. I'm fine, Doris, I smiled. It's just a storm in a glass of water. It'll blow over soon. Doris nodded and went out, and I continued to enjoy my tea, looking at my garden, at my life, which, despite all the losses and disappointments, was still full of beauty and possibilities. After all, as Farley was fond of saying, life is not what happens to you, but what you do with it. So I decided to make the rest of my life meaningful, filled with dignity and freedom from toxic relationships, even if those relationships involved me with my own son. It was a painful decision, but the right one. And sitting in the winter garden surrounded by silence and beauty, I finally felt at peace with myself and the choices I had made.